Imagine being presented with two contracts for the same product, and it's up to you to choose which of the two contracts you would like to enter in. The first contract is a contract that is a very easy contract to fulfill on your part, and it guarantees that you will end up with the desired product. The other contract is a very arduous contract, and it guarantees that you will not end up with the desired product. Now, further imagine that someone would vacillate as to which of the two contracts they would want to sign. This is the condition that Paul believed that the Galatians were in. They were presented with two contracts, one written in the blood of Jesus by grace, which guaranteed the Galatians the desired product, and the other was written by Moses, and it guaranteed that the Galatians would not end up with the product. And the Galatians were vacillating back and forth as to which contract they wanted to sign. Paul was bewildered. So let's look into it and see what Paul thinks about the two contracts and why someone would want the one over the other. Going to use these two and also their offspring, and he's going to use each one of these ladies as an example of a covenant, and then their children are as examples of the people who live underneath those covenants. So let's dig in and walk through this step by step. Okay, so here Paul is going to jump in now. He's going to ask a question. He says here, "Tell me, you that desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondsmaid, which is a slave, the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondswoman was after the flesh, but he of the free woman was after the promise." Let me explain this real quick, the allegory, if you're not familiar with it, or the actual story. So Abraham, God had promised Abraham when Abraham was 75 years old that he would have a child. He had a wife whom he had lived with, Sarah, for nearly 50 years at this time, and they never had a child. So then, and his wife, Sarah, was barren. She couldn't have children. Well, Abraham, for many years, had begun to tell everyone that he was going to have a child and that he was going to be the father of nations because God had promised that to him. Well, after many years passed, and it never took place, Sarah never had a child. Sarah came to Abraham and said, "Abraham, I have a servant whom is it was a slave woman named Hagar, but she was Sarah's slave woman." And she said, "I have a servant that what I'd like to do is I'd like to give her to you, and then you bear a child by her, and then she'll give the child to me and I'll raise the child. And it'll be that way that you will fulfill God's promise." Well, so, and this was actually a custom in the ancient East that barren women would actually do this. So it would actually, even during childbirth, they would be with them during childbirth, and they would help them in the childbirth so that they could have something to do with the birthing of the child. So anyway, Abraham was of a mind not to do this because he did not believe that this was the way God was going to fulfill his promise. However, the Lord came to Abraham and said, "Abraham, hearken unto the voice of thy wife and do as she has asked for you." So Abraham does. Abraham takes the slave woman, he marries her, and so it becomes his second wife. Now Abraham has two wives. Well, the one, if you can keep in mind here, is fulfilling the promise through flesh. Now Paul's going to lean on this heavily through our own works, trying to fulfill what God requires through our own works. So when the child who was a product of that union between Hagar and Abraham was about 14 years old. Well, a few years before that, God actually brought the promised child through Sarah. Sarah, when she was 90 years old, gave birth to to Isaac. Well, what took place was the boys were growing, and Ishmael, which was the other boy, was about 10 years older than Isaac. And he began, as siblings will do, he began to taunt his little brother and pick on him. Well, Sarah became offended because Ishmael was picking on her son Isaac. And so she wanted the child to be put out of the house. So she told Abraham, put the Hagar and her child out of the house. Well, Abraham again was of a mind not to do it because it was his son, and Hagar was his second wife. So he didn't want to do it. But the angel of the Lord came to Abraham and told him to go ahead and put the Hagar and her child out of the house. So Abraham did, under much duress, but Abraham followed the leadership of the Lord. Now, Paul is going to use this story as an allegory, okay? Because if you keep in mind, as Paul has been building up to this, Paul is saying here that, remember, Abraham is the father of the faithful because Abraham believed God, and he's contrasting the two covenants. Now, as we addressed in previous lessons, there are two covenants that Paul is addressing. The first one came by promise to Abraham, God saying to Abraham, in thy seed, singular, which meant Christ, all the world will be blessed. Well, after 430 years, the Israelites in the wilderness disbelieved God, and by not wanting to follow God according to faith like Abraham did, God told Moses to give them a law. So then they could serve God. If they didn't want to serve God by faith, they could serve him by a law, a bunch of do's and don'ts. So then, because of this, then now we have a second covenant running along. So now we have two covenants running along in the providence of God. And if you want to further understand that more clearly, go back and watch our other lessons. But so then now we have two covenants running along. Now, Paul is saying you can serve God by either one, but you can't serve him by both. And now he's going to use these two women as allegories for these two covenants. And then their children that they had, Isaac and Ishmael, as the followers of these covenants. So he's going to contrast them back and forth. Now watch this. Remember, he is addressing the Galatians because the Galatians have decided to quit serving God by faith and start to serve God by legalism. So they quit walking by faith underneath the grace of Christ, and then now they're going to try to please God through the keeping of the law. Now, in this context, the keeping of the law would be the Mosaic law. In today's context, not only would it be the Mosaic law, because it would be, however, it would also be, it would apply to those who want to serve God by legalism, those Christians who desire to serve God by legalism, because they're both the same. The legalism and the law are the same. They're synonymous or interchangeable with each other because you're serving God through a bunch of regulations laid down. So then it would be interchangeable. So that we could properly understand it for today's Christian. Okay, so now watch this right here. Now he's asking the Galatians. He says, tell me, you that desire to be under the law. Do you not hear the law? See, and he is saying that the law is shouting out to you. Okay? For it is written that Abraham had two sons. See, so there's two covenants. The one by a bondmaid and the other by a free woman. So you see the Abraham's offspring, the Jews, ended up having two covenants. The one was a covenant, a promise that God would fulfill in Christ Jesus and redeem the world. The other one was a promise given by Moses on Mount Sinai, and it was the law of Moses, which most people associate with the Old Testament, but it's the law of Moses that was given at Mount Sinai. So he's given, Abraham had two sons, the one by a slave woman and the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondswoman, the slave woman, was born after the flesh. Because remember the original story, Sarah was going to try to fulfill God's promise through her own intellect, through her own ability, or through Abraham and her own ability, which was because they had an inability to fulfill it any other way. So if they're going to do it, they have to do it underneath their own power. He who was of the bondswoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was born after the promise. Because what promise? God originally came to Abraham when Abraham was 75 years old, saying, I will give you a child. Now, Isaac was born because God had promised Abraham, not because Abraham had did anything. See? So Abraham was born because of the promise, not because of any human effort. Now, we're going to see that that as Christians, we are found righteous in the eyes of God because God decided that he was going to redeem us without money, without price, and it was going to be of his own volition and nothing that we could do. And he was going to make us completely and wholly righteous in his eyes because he had promised it. All the way through, from Genesis all the way through the Old Testament, he had promised that he would redeem us. So then we have the two ways of serving God. Watch this. He says in the 24th verse, 4:24, which things are an allegory or an example or a parallel, kind of a story that paints this a picture. For these are the two covenants, the one from Mount Sinai, which was the law of Moses, which gendereth to bondage, or which ends up bringing you into bondage. See? So then a legalistic form of religion will end up bringing the follower into bondage. They'll never be happy. They'll be enslaved to that legalism all of their life, which is Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answers to Jerusalem, which is now. See, which now is, and he's referring to this, which now is, talking about the Jewish religion and the Jews and the temple sacrifice currently in the time of Paul, currently in Jerusalem, and the temple sacrifice that is going on, and all the rituals. Now he's going to get down to deep to even he's going to get this deep to correct some misdoctrines that we have with us even to this day in the Christian religion. Some people still have a misunderstanding, which Paul will correct here. He says, for this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and it answers to Jerusalem, which is now, and is in bondage with her children. So Paul is saying this right here. The irony, now watch this, he's going to get deep into this. Paul is saying that the Jews that are underneath the law, that are in Jerusalem, that are serving according to the temple sacrifice laid out by Moses, the temple sacrifice, the altar and the Levitical priesthood, and is currently in operation in Jerusalem. And all of her, that not only the religious system, but all of her adherences, those who adhere to that, every one of them are in slavery. Now that's a big statement there. Okay? So Paul is saying that not only are they in slavery, but everyone who serves God according to legalism is in slavery to that legalism. You see? But we could apply this in any fashion, even if you set up your own, your church or your denomination sets up its own individualized creeds, that if you do this, you're righteous. If you do this, you're righteous. If you don't do this, you're less righteous or you're not righteous. And people delve these out to different Christians. So you have to be part of our church, and you have to recognize our customs and perform them to be righteous. And if you don't, then you're not righteous or not as righteous. Well, there's a curse for that, because here's the thing is, I don't care what religious system that you make it up. If you make it up all your own, that you pray so many times a day, or that you wear these garments, or that you do these religious acts, you know that in some time in your life, you're going to break at least one of them. Well, then if you do, the moment you do, you're guilty of every single one of it. And even if you're keeping it to the letter and you don't break it from the time you made it up, you broke it before. So then you are a breaker of that covenant. Well, the thing about it is you live underneath that and you never measure up to it. So you're a slave to do those things. You must do them. And they are your taskmaster. They whip you day and night. And this is what Paul is saying. You see, for this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answers to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children. See, those who live that religion or live those legalistic rules are slaves to the rules of legalism. So let's go here. He continues his thought. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free. See, God does have Jerusalem that is in the Middle East currently now, was trying to be a shadow of the real city of God, the real place where God dwells and rules and reigns. You see? So he's saying that, but that is all made by God. The one in the Middle East is all made by man. And it's just a shadow, you see? But the one that's above, it lives free. The one that's in heaven is living free by not the attempts of humanity to be righteous, but it is free because it lives and operates according to God's holiness, not according to man's holiness. You see? So God's holiness will always be greater than man's holiness. And that's actually the root of the matter here, the root of the question. What are you going to live by? Are you going to live by God's holiness, or are you going to live by your holiness? So then Paul is contrasting the two. One is built and lives and dwells in heaven, operates according to God's holiness. The other is on earth, crumbling and decaying all the time, built by the hands of man, held up by the hands of man, and is steadily decaying. So which one is greater? Paul says, but Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. Who's of us all? Us Christians. For it is written, rejoice thou barren that bearest not. Break forth in crying. See, he's speaking of the original promise that was given to Abraham through that he would have a child through Sarah because she was barren. But it's saying, be happy and rejoice as if the child is already here, because once God gave the promise, God will fulfill his word. So be happy about it. So watch. For it is written, rejoice thou that bearest not, break forth into crying thou that travailest not. For the desolate, which means those who are legalistic or serve God according to the law, the desolate has many more children than she which has a husband. You see, so he's contrasting again. You're going to have many more Christians that are willing to serve God according to legalism. Well, but Paul is saying here is he's contrasting this with the Jewish religion. You have many more, and which is at the time, you have many more people that are willing to serve God according to the law than those who are willing just to follow him by grace and trust in him. What is that then? Then essentially, you have many more people trusting in their own works rather than God's works, trusting in their own righteousness rather than God's righteousness. You see? So you can't have both. You're going to either serve God by one or the other. Now, so then Paul is laying hard on this, and then now he's going to dig down deep on this idea that you cannot serve God by both. You will not have both in your life, you will either have grace or legalism. You will either try to please God through the righteousness of Christ, or you will try to find to become pleasing in the eyes of God through your own works, keeping your own tents by which is laid down either by you or your church. See, you're going to try to find favor in the eyes of God through one or the other, but you cannot find favor in the eyes of God through both. You will end up taking one or the other. So then he says here, watch, in the 6th verse through the 10th. Seeing therefore it remained that some must enter therein, and they to whom it was first preached entered not in because of unbelief. Okay, now watch this. He's going to bring in another allegory here. So then we're going to have, in these 4 verses here, we're going to have 2 allegories running together. And he's doing this to make a point. He assumes that his reader is well versed and they would immediately understand the second allegory. Okay, so here's the second allegory he's getting ready to bring in. When the children of Israel, before they received the law, when they were in the wilderness, they rejected the idea of following God by grace, so God gave them a law. Okay? However, they did have a promise of entering into God's rest. Okay? So then, after the death of Moses, the children of Israel wandered around the wilderness after they received the law for 40 years. Then Moses died. Once Moses died, then Joshua came and took them into the promised land, or the land of promise. Now, notice even this here, he's going to bring in this second allegory that the land of promise was taken by the sword. So it was taken by human effort. So then he is contrasting this, that the law was given in Mount Sinai in the wilderness, and the promised land was taken by human effort. Again, this is all a law of bondage, and not only a law of bondage, but the adherents, those who adhere to it, were in slavery. So he's going to bring this in. Now what he says here, he says, seeing therefore it remaineth that some must enter therein, talking about the promised land, and they to whom it was first preached entered not in because of unbelief. That's when the law was given. So the people who came out in the wilderness, all of them came out into the wilderness from Exodus by the hand of Moses, all of them died. None of them lived except for Joshua and Caleb, 2 people, 2 of the spies who believed God. All the rest of them who did not believe God died, and their children went ahead and went in. Okay? But so then he's saying that the first ones didn't go in. As a result, they didn't go in because they didn't believe God. As a result, the law was given, and then some people still had to go in to fulfill the promise that God was going to bring. He told Abraham that your children will sojourn in a foreign land, and then after so many years, I'll bring them back out and bring them back to this spot. Okay? So then there had to be some of Abraham's children enter in, but the first generation did not enter in because of unbelief, and they received the law. Now, Paul is going to say, though, even though they did, their children entered in, it still wasn't the fulfillment of the full promise of God. Now watch this right here. Seeing therefore it remaineth that some must enter therein, and they to whom it was first preached entered not in because of unbelief. Again, he limited a certain day. Let me let you read this with me. Again, he limited a certain day, saying in David, today, after so long a time, as it is said, today, if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, then would he not afterwards have spoken of another day? Now, Remember, if you're remember in our previous lesson, Paul addressed, he said, I'm worried about you Galatians who have went back to the law and now you started keeping the regulations of the law as righteousness. And you start to keep different days of the week as holy, different days of the months or the months of the year as holy months. And you have done that to try to find favor in the eyes of God. You're fallen from grace. And I'm worried about you. Now he's going to get into that, readdress that heavily here. And he says, so now he is going to actually address the topic of keeping certain days of the week as holy. And he's going to say that, remember, God rested on the seventh day. So God created the world in everything. He created everything in 6 days, and then he rested on the seventh day. Now, and he ceased from his labor. He never went back up and picked back up and started working again on the eighth day. So in the law, now watch this right here. In the law of Moses, which was given 430 years after the covenant of promise was given to Abraham, which covenant was gendered unto grace. In that, he gave them all symbols because they couldn't follow the true by faith. He gave them a symbolic religion that would foreshadow the true that they couldn't keep. Does that make sense? So then they are going to receive a symbolic religion that they can perform by the works of their hands because they couldn't receive and follow the true religion that was given previously by God to Abraham. In doing so, there were many things that were symbolic and that foreshadowed what was in the true covenant that they could not keep. One of those things would have been the sacrificial lamb and the sprinkling of blood on the altar. See, because Christ was going to be the true sacrificial lamb and he was going to sprinkle his blood on the altar and on the people. And so then Moses sprinkled the blood on the people. And the different symbolism that was in the law that the Israelites were going to foreshadow from the time of Moses all the way to Christ. They were going to foreshadow it because they couldn't live the true by faith. So they were going to do an inferior way of serving God. But still in that inferior way, it was going to be a shadow that would kind of ring out and have a certain ring of what the truth would actually be. But it came in because of unbelief or sin. It was never intended by God, the law of Moses. So then, watch this right here. He says, now he's going to speak, and Paul just says that I'm worried about you because now you Gentiles who have started to serve God, you Galatians who have started to serve God according to the manner in which the Jews could not in the wilderness, you began that way, and now you have fallen from that way, and you did like they have done, or like they did in the wilderness, and started to go back to unbelief and serving God according to that lesser covenant. And you've begun to keep a certain day of the week as that day is holy, as if that was the original intent of the Sabbath day, which it never was. So the original intent of the Sabbath day is once the work was done to never work again. Okay. So then here's what Paul's going to explain here, that if you're trying to serve God underneath your own works, then you're laboring. But there has to come a time when you cease from your labors and you quit trying to serve God and please God according to your own works. And then that has to come to an end. Then you have to just cease and never go back to that, trying to serve God underneath your own works. And then in doing so, you have to then try to please God underneath the works of his righteousness. So rely on Christ. Once you do that, you cease from your labors and you never go back to it again. And so then you always lay on grace, never on works. So you're always serving God according to grace. You're never serving God according to legalism. It's not like because in the covenant on Mount Sinai, the Jews would rest on Saturday, but on Sunday again, they would start back all their labors again. So it couldn't have been, Paul's going to say here, that couldn't have been what the true Sabbath was or even is. It was just an allegory of what the true Sabbath actually is. The true Sabbath was to cease from your righteousness and lean on God's righteousness, then you never rely on your works again. So then from that time till eternity, into eternity, and throughout eternity, you never rely on your own works. You rely on the righteousness of Christ. You see? And then he's going to say, and then he's going to use this as a promise, as even Joshua, when he took him into the promised land, that wasn't the rest. Nor was it a day when Moses gave him a day. Because had that actually been the fulfillment, God wouldn't have spoken of in another time about a certain day. So then, but God had kept foreshadowing that there will come a day when you will cease from your labors and you will rest in my labors. And so then, but Paul is worried about these Galatians because they've gone back to start keeping the seventh day of the week as it's holy, and that's God's true Sabbath. So watch this here. You can see Christians nowadays still have got this wrong, and they've done what the Galatians did. And then even some go even further than trying to keep the Saturday as if it was the holy day. Some go even further and start trying to keep the Jewish rituals, like the Feast of the Passover, the Feast of Pentecost, or one of these feasts, which is even more bondage. So watch what Paul is saying here. He says, seeing therefore there remaineth some that must enter in therein, and they to whom it was first preached entered not in because of unbelief. Again he limited a certain day, saying in David, today, after so long a time, as it is said, today, if you will hear his voice. See, right now he spoke to David. Now enter into God's rest. Cease from your works right now. When? The day you hear it. From this very moment, it's not you're waiting one day for God to do something, and not you're waiting that you can do something to become righteous. No, the very second you hear the gospel of your salvation, that day, rely on Jesus Christ. That's why you would hear the apostles, when they address a sinner, they would say things like, do you believe? You see? So from this time forward, if you believe that God cleanses us from all unrighteousness, and from that day forward, you cease from your works and enter into his works. See, that's what he's saying here. Today, after so long a time, as it is said to David, if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, then would he not afterwards have spoken, talk about God, would not afterwards have spoken of another day. See, there is a time. There remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God. So then there remains, even after the law of Mount Sinai, the law was given at Mount Sinai, and the seventh day Sabbath was introduced. That wasn't it. Then even after Joshua took the people, that wasn't the rest of God. Then Joshua took the whole nation of Israelites into the promised land and gave them the promised land. That wasn't the rest. We can still say, even to this day, the Zionist movement is trying to rebuild it, but that won't be the rest. They're trying to reintroduce what Joshua had given them, but that still won't be the rest they're seeking. You see? For if Joshua had given them rest, then he would not afterwards have spoken of another day. There remains therefore a rest to the people of God. For he that is entered into his, Christ, rest, he also ceases from his own works, as God did from his. See? Not pick it back up the next day of the week, Sunday. You see? So then it couldn't have been that. It couldn't have been the seventh day was God's Sabbath. So what is keeping God's Sabbath always is it has to be something that wherein the believer ceases from their own works and never goes back and does that again. Never works like that again. Because that's what God did. God, once he rested, he has never went back and started the creation process all over again. So then this is what Paul's saying. It has to be that. Well, how do you enter into God's rest and cease from your own labors? What is the point? This is a way you have to interpret the scriptures is, what is the context? He's talking about being righteous in the eyes of God. So the labors then that he's referring to here is becoming righteous in the eyes of God. So then at what point do you cease from your works and you enter into God's works? The moment you lay down your own righteousness and you pick up the righteousness of Christ. You see, he has ceased, because we will never, if a true believer will ever lays down their righteousness and picks up the righteousness of Christ, they will never pick back up their own righteousness again. They will never try to boast how righteous they are. Again, it's always Jesus is good. Jesus is righteous. So then he hath also ceased, the 10th verse, from his own works as God did from his. You see, that error has still come down after 2,000 years, is still with us today. People pick it up because not understanding what the original covenant was and not understanding that there were two covenants. And the second one was a covenant that was introduced because of sin. And it was a covenant that was introduced to get the people back, a secondary covenant, to get them back to the original covenant. But so it ran simultaneously with the original covenant. Because people misunderstand that nowadays, Christians misunderstand that, they tried to go be Seventh-day observers or other law keepers. Okay, so let's go down to the next verse here. That was in Hebrews 4 and 6 to 10. So now let's go down to the 28th verse. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. Okay, so then we are the children of promise. So then who are we? We Christians. We are the children that are serving God according to the promise. We are not those who serve God according to a law or a covenant of bondage. You see? So then there are two types of believers, worshipers in the world. There are only two. Even, let's be honest with you, friends, even the pagans that are in the world today are trying to be righteous according to their own works. You ask a sinner, do you think that you'll go to heaven when you die? Immediately they always say, I'm a good person. See, always relying on their own works. Every pagan religion, and Paul addressed this in the previous lesson, even the pagan religions, all the pagan religions of the Gentiles, they're all doing the same thing. Every one of them are trying to serve God according to their own works. Okay? So then what are they? They are the children of a slave woman. This is what Paul's saying. Okay? But there are two covenants running along. If you're serving God according to grace and according to his righteousness, you're on the first covenant and you're a child of the free woman. If you're serving God according to how good you are and how righteous you are, how much you keep the tenets of your religion, how much you keep them and how closely you keep them, then you are a child of a slave woman and you were born in slavery and you'll be a slave all your life. This is what Paul is saying. Okay, now we, brethren, talk about Christians, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. Now, even Christians can fall out of this and fall into children of slavery, because what they do is they become religious observers of their own legalism. Let's go down to the 29th verse. He says, but as then he that was born after the flesh, the slave child, persecuted him that was born after the spirit, even so it is now. You will find this in every single time and place in the world. The legalistic person, whether that is a law keeper or a Christian, the legalistic religious believer will always persecute the person who lives by grace. They'll always find fault with them. They will always say how that they are unrighteous, how that they are dirty or that they are unholy or different things like that. They will always do it. And this is what Paul's saying. The same as Ishmael was persecuting Isaac, Those that are in bondage always persecute those that are free. The reason why Paul is saying this is because there is a truth in this. Paul says, so it is now. There's a truth in this aspect, is the fact that a person who is free, who serves God, a Christian, who serves God according to God's righteousness and never looks at his own, there is a freedom about his life. There is an air of lightness that he doesn't feel like he has to earn God's favor. He just has it. Because of that, those that are in bondage under legalism are jealous over. And because of that jealousy, it's an inward. Sometimes they won't even admit it to themselves. But because of that jealousy, it will cause them to go and persecute those who live by freedom. Okay? Paul says in the 29th verse here, he says, but as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the Spirit, even so it is now. Now Paul he builds the case here, and now he's going to give us a solution to then what can we do? Well, okay, so maybe as this lesson went on, okay, you have found that I've served God according to legalism. I am one of those legalistic Christians. I have served God according to trying to please him, according to my own righteousness. But I see that now. I see that that's no good. Or I've tried to keep a shadow of the true. And by trying to keep a shadow of the true, I've tried to please God through the shadow, which it was introduced because of unbelief. Like, let's say I'm a keeper of the seventh day of the week, Saturday, or another rituals or things like that. And I have found, yes, I see my error of my ways. Let's say you're a Galatian. Put yourself in their shoes and that you are receiving this letter and you just now left. Let's say your Saturday synagogue service. Okay. Let's say your Saturday service. And you felt like I just now pleased God. And then a friend or a colleague of yours tells you to come over. I got a copy of the letter that Paul sent. I want to read it to you. And you felt like you just pleased God. You just kept the Sabbath. And then you read this and you find, wow, I find myself in error. What do I do then? Or let's just say you're a legalistic Christian. You've always tried to please God according to your own righteousness, how good you are. And you realize, I'll never be good enough. You see? Why will you never be good enough? Here's why, friends. Is because I want you to, for a moment, I want you to take the most righteous person that you can possibly think of in your own understanding. That might be a sainted grandmother. That might be one of the apostles. That might be a leader of your church, maybe the leader of your denomination, considered the most holy man in the world, whatever that case may be. Maybe it's yourself. Maybe you think you're the holiest person. Whatever that is, think of the most holy person that you can possibly think of. Now take their holiness and I want you to times it, their holiness by 1 billion. No, let's go even further. Times their holiness by 1 trillion. Okay? Then I want to tell you, whatever number you arrive at, whatever amount of holiness now you have arrived at, I want to tell you that is a trillion times a trillion, trillions of light years away from the righteousness that is required by God. You see? It would be akin to the concept of trying to heat outer space with a match. All of it. Heat every bit of it up with a match. See how far how far short it falls? There's only one righteousness that comes even close to fulfilling the righteous requirements of God, and that's God's righteousness. That's it. So then God had to come down and give us a sacrifice. You see? God doesn't want our righteousness. He wants his righteousness. Because our righteousness, as Paul said, are as filthy rags in the eyes of God. Go look that true meaning of that, what those filthy rags meant. And you'll be, I think, surprised. So anyway, Paul says here, so then if you find yourself, you're sitting there and you find yourself as one of these Galatians did, then what do I do now? Paul's going to tell us now what to do. In the 30th verse, he says, he's going to give us the answer, then what we should do from this time forward. Nevertheless, what saith the scriptures? Cast out the bondswoman and her son. For the son of the bondswoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. That is an amazing verse to me, friends. It is one of the most amazing verses in the Bible to me. Look, what is he saying here? You cannot have both religions. You cannot have both covenants. You cannot try to have one and the other. So let me just say this right here. If you think that you are holy because of the things you do not have God's righteousness. You do not have God's holiness. You have one or the other. Well, friends, you can immediately see every individual, I don't care who they are, you can immediately see whose righteousness they have. If they go, well, I pray so many times, I fast, immediately you know they don't have the righteousness of God. That is a poor, poor, poor person. I would not want to be them on the day of judgment. You see? I'm not saying where they'll be, but I'm just telling you this. I would not want to be them on the day of judgment. However, if you notice that their go-to is, let's say somebody criticizes a person for being a sinner. So like one Christian criticizes another person for being a sinner, or let's say being a backslider or something like that. They find fault with the person. And you're going to see a third person, when they hear it, they immediately go, well, if it was not for grace, there go I. You see? Or, yeah, I know we all fall short. You see? And they're always saying things like that. I can tell you whose righteousness they have. They have God's righteousness. You see? Immediately, well, judge yourself. Paul even said to the Corinthians, judge yourself and you shall not be judged, or you should not be condemned when the world is condemned. If you rightly judge yourself, whose righteousness do you have? You see, Paul says, okay, if you find that I believe that I have God's righteousness, okay, we'll go with you there. However, you're always leaning on how good you are and how much maybe better you are than the next person, man or woman. Then you're trying to have both in the same house. And both of them cannot be heirs. What he's saying here, because in our previous lesson, in the first part of the chapter, Paul described that you're going to have a child that's going to inherit the whole estate of a rich man. Going to inherit the whole estate. One of these children, you're going to have a child that's going to do it. Well, then you have two children in the house. One of them is going to inherit the whole estate. Both of them, it's a mathematical impossibility for both of them to inherit the whole estate. Either one is going to inherit the whole estate or the other is going to inherit the whole estate. If you try to give them both together, then at best, both of them would inherit half of the estate. Well, you cannot have half of salvation. You see? You cannot have half of God's of a heavenly reward. You either have you can only have one or the other. So then, if you find that you think you're relying on Christ's righteousness, but you tout your own righteousness, your own good works, then you have two people living in your house. One of them is going to end up being the inheritor of all of your works on the day of judgment. Which one will it be? Paul's saying, my advice to you is kick out the slave child. Because if you kick out the slave child, it is inevitable that the free child will inherit the whole estate. You see, there won't be a fight after you die, right? As has been through so many monarchies. The children fight over the throne. So he says, cast it out. So then that's what he's saying here. If you have that type of religion, get rid of it. You Galatians, get rid of it. If you Christians nowadays, if you're trying to be a law keeper, you're trying to be a Seventh-day keeper, so then you're relying on that and not relying on God's righteousness, God's rest. I rely on his righteousness, which is my rest. You see, which is actually his rest, but I enter into his rest. He says, nevertheless, what saith the scriptures? Cast out the bondswoman, the slave woman, and her son. See, get rid of that type of religion. For the son of the bondswoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. They can't both be heirs together. Let's go to the next one. The 31st, which is our last. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondswoman, but of the free. Who's the we here? Us Christians. Us Christians that are relying on God's righteousness. We're not law keepers. We're not Seventh-day keepers. We're not legalistic keepers of our own making, of our own church, our own denomination. We're relying 100% on God's righteousness. Then we are the children of the free. Or remember, these two women were the two covenants. The one was by grace, the other was by works. So then we are the child of the covenant by promise, which was given to Abraham, which was a faith promise, a faith covenant. So then, we Christians are the recipient of the original promise given to Abraham, which was by grace through faith. That original promise. See? So then, our identity then is rooted in Sarah, not Hagar, not legalism, but in grace, in faith, not human efforts. Then we are heirs of the promise, which is God's rest through Jesus Christ, God's favor through Jesus Christ. You know how Christ said, Father, I know that you hear me always. You see, that favor, that type of favor, we become heirs of that type of favor through Jesus Christ. We know God hears us always. There's no time that we bow our heads if we live according to the promise. There's no time that we bow our heads that God doesn't hear. We are inheritors of that type of favor before God because we are sons and daughters of God. But we receive that through Christ, which would have been the original promise, which Paul's allegory here, and Paul's allegory was Sarah, which was the original promise given by God to Abraham. Grace is our foundation, not works, not heritage, and not law, but grace through Christ. So then, I wanted to, what's our takeaway or our application here is the fact that our identity, we identify not with bondage, but with freedom. We are to recognize where we may be relying on areas of bondage and get them out of our life. Start relying on the original covenant, which was by faith through the promise. Ask yourself, am I living like a child of Hagar or of Sarah? Are you taking up your yoke of Christ, which is easy, or the yoke of religion, which is a heavy one to bear? Which one have you taken up? The day you got saved, imagine that you took up the yoke of Christ. You were just so elated that Jesus would be willing to save a sinner like you. In the meantime, from that hour till this, have you somewhere picked up a yoke of religion and now you're bearing that? When I say religion, I'm talking about legalism. And that is a very heavy yoke to bear. I tell you, as of right now, when you hear my voice, cast off that yoke and pick back up one. Oh, you will face persecution from those who still wear that yoke. As Paul said, they always do it. If you cast off legalism, the legalistic person will from that time forward, they will persecute you. But just like Ishmael persecuted Isaac, just like the Judaizers persecuted Paul, just like many of the Pharisees persecuted Christ, they will persecute you, but you can take it because the weight of grace is so much easier than the persecution that the legalistic religious person can delve out. You're a child of the freedom, not a child of bondage. That's your identity. Don't let guilt or religious pressure distort your status in Christ. Remain faithful to your identity that you are a child of the free and not a child of bondage. Stand in, therefore, then you're going to, our takeaway is stand in the gospel of liberty. Separate yourself from any system or influence that requires rule keeping. Separate yourself from it. Guard your heart against a subtle return to legalism. Make sure you never get caught back into it. The very second you recognize it, that you're getting caught back into legalism, people are bringing condemnation because you're not keeping a certain religious rituals that they themselves require or the system requires. Immediately get away from it. Stand in the gospel of liberty. You will be so proud that you do. And not only that, you will also transfer that gospel of liberty to your wife and your children, to your family and friends, to everyone around you, to your church if you're a minister. Start preaching the gospel of grace, of liberty, not of legalism. You will be so proud that you did. And you will be transmitting a gospel that is not only livable, but is enjoyable to the people. If you're a minister, transmit that to your church. Do like Paul. Be willing to face the persecution. Oh, many of them might persecute you, but stand the persecution for the sake of your congregation, for the sake of the people who listen to you. They're relying on you to be their guard, to be their leader. So, in conclusion here, now we brethren, the 28th and the 31st, now we brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. So, until next lesson, rely on the righteousness of Jesus Christ. God be with you.